Welcome to Measurably Better Learning, the podcast built for learning and development professionals. Whether you're an instructional designer, L&D professional, or corporate leader, get ready for insights and ideas that will transform your approach to learning, training, and development. So let's dive in. Welcome to this episode of the Measurably Better Learning podcast. My guest today is Miriam Taylor, and this is actually part two. Part one of curriculum mapping, you'll be able to find. This is part two. We're going to dive a little bit more into theory, and then in the second half of the podcast, we'll get into some case studies and real-life examples. So, Miriam, let's dig deeper into the components of a curriculum map. What are the essential elements?
Yeah, so I'm going to have to ask our listeners to kind of visualize this. I think we'll have a graphic on the screen, but if you can picture a chart, right? So horizontally, we talked about these topics, but as a quick review, you're going to have your business objectives and goals. You're going to have stakeholders as a column. You're going to probably have maybe either a business unit or the organization's values.
This is where you're collecting data.
You're collecting the data. Okay. You're filling it in. Then specifically what's most important, of course, is listing your topics. Those might even be existing learning assets that you have or topics, and then the objectives for them. So that's kind of your horizontal. And then on the vertical, what you're listing are, and these are what really drive the conversation, priorities. And that's the big kickoff conversation, right? What are our priorities? And then probably a better question, another item on that vertical would be, what are the risks? Because sometimes, priorities could be about the same, or we don't know, or we don't have consensus. But if we ask, well, what happens if we don't? Suddenly, that's a very different conversation.
That is. And that's an interesting thought, because there are risks if you do things and there are risks if you don't. And so there's a cost-benefit analysis going both directions.
Right.
And many of the times learning people aren't thinking about that.
They're not.
Yeah.
Right. And then probably the last thing would be benefits, which still speaks to that, because maybe there's this additional benefit that makes one priority really leap to the top. So that's another thing. And the thing with a curriculum map, too, is that for every organization, it's going to look a little different. You might put different components in it, but it's a way to, instead of just sitting at a table and free-for-alling a conversation, right? We have a structured way we're having a conversation. And when we're done, we have a list of our priorities.
I want to get really practical here. I know that you have done curriculum mapping exercises where we fly or go or drive or whatever somewhere, and everybody sits in a room, and you've got this, this whole day, in some instances, really big projects, 2 days. How does that go now? I mean, post-pandemic, and again, many of our clients are Fortune 100, Fortune 500. These people might be remote in the same country, or they might be spread out all over the place. You and I have talked to a couple of companies just this week where we were talking to people in 3 or 4 or 5 different nations. How does that go? Do you stick somebody in a room for 8 hours and you do a curriculum map and they never speak to you again?
No, because I don't want to be in that room for 8 hours. I mean,
so how does this go?
Yeah. So it actually works quite well virtually, but it does, practically speaking, from a facilitation standpoint. When we first started, a client would block maybe half a day. But here's the thing, you are really operating at the top of Bloom's taxonomy, or however you choose to explain it. You are doing a lot of analyzing and synthesizing. You're breaking things down. You're rebuilding them. And it's exhausting.
And you're listening intently. Yep.
So also your consensus building.
I mean, you're watching the people in the room, how they're reacting.
Exactly.
And, who's doing this, and who's got their head back. And so you're taking in a ton of data all at the same time.
Right. So I would argue for maybe an hour and a half to 2 at the most. And also it's just nice to have a break. And we have done it where we've done a session in the morning and a session at lunch. The other thing I would say is we always, as a group of learning professionals, take at least 2, if not 3 people. So you have one person facilitating the conversation. You need the other person manually, whether we use like a Miro board or a whiteboard, virtually, obviously, we're using a Miro or another graphic organizer. Someone is putting in the topics, moving them around as the conversation flows. And if it's possible to have a third person who can, like you said, they're watching faces, they might be answering questions in the chat, something like that. But you might not have that luxury, but you absolutely have to have at least two people to handle that kind of a conversation.
Okay. Fun question for you, and I'm sure this has happened. Have you ever had one of these that just went really badly? And why?
Yeah, so they can go badly for two reasons. One, I think, is salvageable. The other one, maybe not. So it can go poorly because the learning team has to walk in blind. Mm-hmm. So we would prefer we send out information ahead of time. We try to collect as much information. So
you're sending them some sort of form where they know what the questions are going to be. So the idea is you're prepping their mind to think.
Yes.
Okay.
And gathering facts and so we can pre-populate. So we're giving them a place to react. We might not have all the answers. We might not have it totally right. Because otherwise, if you're there and you're just staring at each other because they didn't bring what they need and we have nothing to react to, we have very unproductive session.
And if that some data comes to you ahead of time, you have time live to confirm. What I hear you saying is, what I saw here is everybody in the room, good. Everybody on the screen, good.
Right.
Interesting.
Right. And the only other way that it would go south, and there's nothing you can do as a learning team, is if you can't get consensus, with your stakeholders. And in that case, that's a project sponsor saying, you know what, we need to take this back internal. Let us get consensus, and then we'll come back and work with you.
And that does happen. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and talk about some real live use cases and case studies. Looking forward to that.
Imagine a world where every training session, every learning module, and every translated document is aligned with your company's unique goals and global ambitions. Welcome to Ingenuity, where we don't just talk about elevating your corporate learning, we make it happen. At Ingenuity, we understand the heart of your business is its people. That's why we specialize in creating custom learning solutions and translation services that are not just effective, but are designed specifically for your business's global needs. Let us show you how learning cannot be just better, but measurably better, with solutions tailored just for you. Learn more in the description below.
Welcome back, everybody. I've been talking with Miriam Taylor about curriculum mapping, and now we're going to get practical. We're going to talk some real-life examples. You have done this with many, many organizations, some small, some nonprofits, some absolutely enormous for-profits, global companies, publicly traded companies. Walk us through some of your more memorable experiences.
So I think that I alluded to the whole consensus building. So one example, sort of an early, again, it was very early after COVID. And I was a part of, with a group, a client who had not seen each other. And
that's true. If you're doing this remotely, you might actually be dealing with a group.
Right.
They've never physically met each other.
Right. And it became apparent really quickly. And I think prior to this, I had thought of curriculum mapping as largely a learning and development exercise to get us to the curriculum that we need. And I think it mostly is. But it just became really apparent in that situation that it was much more about renewing relationships and consensus building and trust and all of that.
Yeah. And they might know about each other, but they might not know each other.
Yeah.
And they might come into the room defensive or have misgivings about one another.
Or unsure of the purpose and
or whose territory is this. Yeah. Kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So another, and I guess the next two I think are pretty typical situations, but one client we worked with, learning and development teams are under a lot of pressure. It seems like there's always a fire to put out.
Always.
People come to them, you have to solve this problem. And so we worked with someone who basically had, I'm trying to think now, I think it might have even been an opportunity. I don't know, but they saw it, seized the moment, plunged in, like, boy, did we love the enthusiasm. They're developing modules right and left. And halfway through our needs assessment, we realized just by asking simple questions, the client realized, oh man, I don't know. Like, I think I talked about that in module 6 and module 5. And there was no plan. And so we loved the enthusiasm. We said, let's just take a step back. Let's get a clear plan of what topics you want to talk about. And more importantly, they didn't really have any clear objectives. And so let's figure out what your goals are, and then we'll go.
So this is the equivalent of just getting in your car and driving fast, right? With your foot to the floor.
Like they were on vacation, though. They were having fun.
They were having fun. They were excited to leave, but they had no idea where they were going. And that's, I mean, we talk about that, right? A lot of a curriculum map as a roadmap. Mm-hmm. Matter of fact, we have a webinar coming up where that's our primary consideration is thinking about a curriculum map as a roadmap. Mm-hmm. Other stories.
Well, no, I would say probably the last one is also typical of a lot of learning and development groups. But we just had a client who delivered this very similar, so it was a leadership topic, series of topics in multiple units of the organization, in multiple formats and in multiple delivery, right? Because every group that would come to her would say, can you present this, but we want this little twist on it. And then can you present over here? And then some of them wanted it virtual. Some of them wanted it all day. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is we have this huge group of learning assets. You know, the PowerPoint had been modified 50 times for different situations. There were some e-learning modules. There were agendas and workbooks that were all basically the same, but not. Mm-hmm. And so a curriculum map is a great way to kind of level set. What do we have? What works? What doesn't work? And go from there.
Were the objectives different or were the activities different?
Largely the activities, but in this case, I think it was hard for the client to really understand that, that it was mostly activities. Your objectives are the same.
Okay.
It also speaks to like a minor point, but something that curriculum mapping often forces. How often is it? It's just hard to stay organized as learning. You might have shared drives and all of that, but at the end of the day, you have 45 learning assets that you've done. And so it kind of forced an organization. Like, let's get all those assets on the table. Mm-hmm. Let's see what we have. Let's sort through it. So that was a little bit different, but it really worked well in that case.
When I think of a curriculum map, we built a house a number of years ago. And I just think of the blueprinting process, meeting with the architect who eventually came up, developed the blueprint. And there's a whole series of questions. And he started by asking us, what type of people are you? Mm-hmm. Well, what do you like to do? What are your goals? Do you have grandchildren? Does your family gather a lot? Is it just the two of you? And it was, I'm like, what?
It's kind of invasive.
Yeah, come on, man. What are you doing here? But it made sense to me because he was trying to figure out what our goals and objectives were, and somehow that was going to translate into a piece of paper that would then function as the one source of truth. Mm-hmm. And you think about how many other people are going to touch it. There are going to be electricians and plumbers and framers and siders and whatever else there are, right? And some people that pour cement, and all of them are going to refer back to that single
source of truth.
Mm-hmm. And that's the source of truth for everything. Mm-hmm. Does my analogy work?
Yeah, no, it really does because coming out of that then, and we'll probably have podcasts about this, but then you get more detailed, right? Like we know our topics and our objectives. Now, what are the deliverables that we're going to make?
Right.
And that's when you start to pick out the faucet for the bath.
Right.
We're to that level of detail.
There were still decisions to be made.
Yeah.
But the plan,
yep.
And it all has to fit together.
Yep.
Because if they don't go in the right order or, somebody deviates, wow.
Right.
That's going to be a mess. So, good. Well, Miriam, again, I have absolutely enjoyed this conversation with you on the fascinating topic of curriculum mapping. So thank you for sharing stories and your expertise.
Thanks for having me today, Jerry.
Before we wrap up the show, if you're looking to dive deeper, we've got tons of free downloads, L&D resources, and details about upcoming webinars that you won't want to miss. They're found in the episode description. Plus, if you ever want to chat with either one of us, now's your chance. You can find links in the episode description to connect directly with Miriam or me. We're here to answer your questions and to discuss all things learning and development. And speaking of questions, we love hearing from you. Whether it's a question or a comment or a topic you're curious about, or if you just want to join the conversation, drop us a comment on your favorite social media channel. Your input shapes our shows. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. It's the best way to ensure you never miss out on our latest episode. We're excited to continue to transform learning into a measurable success with you. Until next time.